There's something that I need to tell you. You're in the center of a dangerous global experiment with food and energy supply chains, and the last 2 years in Europe are a trailer of what is to come. That's the scary realization that Jordan Peterson just had in his conversation with Bjorn Lomborg as he exposes the sheer negligence of Europe's leaders for their overdependence on Russian gas. Just watch this before we get into it.
It was completely obvious that unidimensional dependence on the Russians for vital energy sources was a bad strategic idea. And that's even the case, I would say, in some sense, if Russia was a clear ally and we weren't in a war with them, because you don't want your entire economy so unresilient that you're dependent on a single source for your fundamental resource. And everyone who had any sense whatsoever could see that just as clearly as they could see the daylight sun. And then the second issue here, and I don't think people do understand this, is that every energy source has risks. So, for example, if you put solar panels on your roof, you pose a risk to the workmen who install it because they fall off the roof. And you might think, well, that's trivial danger, but way more people are killed installing solar panels every year than are killed by nuclear power, for example. And so every energy source has its risks. And I grew up in northern Alberta, and people had fracked there for decades. No one was concerned about it in the least. And so then when everyone started to short out about the dangers of fracking, we all knew, people that I knew that that was just rubbish. But even more importantly, if you are concerned environmentally, and there are some reasons to be concerned environmentally, you would have to point to the fact that the Americans and their success with fracking drove their carbon emissions down 15%, I believe. And as you pointed out, they're the only industrialized country that has managed this. And so if you were really concerned about the environment and not just an idiot communist anti-capitalist, you would note that and you'd think, well, this is a lot better than the alternative, which is high energy prices, which are hard on the poor, hyper dependence on the Russians as single source energy, and then the fact that if you don't frack, you have to turn to alternate energy sources that are going to pollute or leave you vulnerable.
The European continent found itself stuck between a rock and a hard place the moment the Ukraine conflict began in February 2022. For one, the continent's own untapped natural gas reserves, especially in the east, were left untouched because of the environmentalist sway on its politics. Europe later found it simply couldn't meet its energy supplies cheaply without Russian gas basically just shifting the carbon footprint abroad while depending dangerously on Russia. At its peak, more than 40% of Europe's natural gas came from Russia. Did no one leading the countries at the European Parliament realize how big of an energy valve they had given in the hands of Putin? Well, they found out the consequences of that pretty quickly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, having to swiftly cut down that 40% figure to 8% for fear of potentially funding an invasion in their own direction. And guess what that ended up doing in the freezing harsh winters of Europe? Well, it shot up household electricity prices by 69% and natural gas prices by a staggering 145%. That means that in a continent where already hundreds of thousands of people lose their lives to the extreme cold, the lack of cheap energy for household heating meant that the continent saw over 68,000 excess lives lost in the same year, attributable to rise in energy costs. Think of that number again because it's easy to lose the humanity of every single person in such a large statistic like this. The vulnerability left in Europe's energy systems, left for the environment, were justified on the basis of protecting human life, and yet those disastrous policies ended up taking more lives than even the pandemic could in the same year. Energy is not a one-dimensional game because it ties to 100 other things that we cannot control.
So look, if we had a wonderful, peacefully coexisting world, there's nothing wrong with getting your power from other places because actually, where they can do it most effectively is probably a better idea. But obviously, we don't live in that world. And I think it's been clear for most people, at least for a decade or two, that Putin was probably not our best ally. And so clearly, we should have been more concerned. This is what happens. I think this is sort of the step back we need to take. This is what happens when you only worry about global warming. If global warming is the only thing on your radar, you obviously forget all the other things. Remember, every winter, we probably see about 300,000 to 600,000 people die from cold in Europe. We don't have a good sense of proportion if we're only focused on and it's actually a lot more, so 100, 200,000 people that actually die from heat across the year, but forget the many, many more that die from cold. And that's what we're going to see this winter when we run out of sufficient fossil fuels. And some people are going to start freezing. We will be much, much more worried about cold waves than heat waves. But that's not how the media present it. And that's why we're in trouble.
I think we're apocalyptic because everybody knows in their heart of hearts that everything comes to an end. And we have to contend with that. Our lives come to an end. The lives of those we love come to an end. Civilizations come to an end. And we also know that there's an association between the morality of our actions and the likelihood of a cataclysmic end. And part of the utility of a functioning religious enterprise is to help us manage those apocalyptic visions without them contaminating everything we do.
About 1 billion people are likely to be starving. And this winter, it'll probably be even more because we don't have enough food. One of the ways you produce food in this world is through fertilizer. Fertilizer is what drives us. But of course, most synthetic fertilizer is made with gas. And so when the EU was approached, should we not make more fertilizer for the world? They go, oh, but that's going to make us use more gas. No, I think we'll not do that. There's something morally wrong about this of saying, yeah, you know what? A couple 100 million people are going to starve, but at least we didn't use extra gas. The same way as much of the rich world is saying to the poor world, you guys, we got rich from using lots of fossil fuels, but you guys, you don't really need that, which of course, to a very large extent, means leaving them in poverty. And of course, they don't actually accept to do that.
That is where it ties into the Russia-Ukraine conflict as well, because what do you think happens when developing countries see their energy supplies squeezed or made expensive in the name of climate change or carbon footprints? They go to the place where they can get their energy the cheapest. In the wake of the invasion, just as Russia's natural gas became weaponized by Putin against Europe, it also became his greatest bargaining chip for other countries like China and India, who were lured by the low prices of Russian gas at the same time of the global inflation. Just in the last 1 year, India's bought more than $37 billion worth of gas from Russia, whereas in the year of the invasion, China ramped up its imports of Russian gas to an incredible $60 billion in 2022 alone, nearly doubling it from the pre-invasion year. So clearly no one else is willing to starve themselves of energy or inflate their economies for the sake of an undefined and unrealistic environmentalist goal. That leaves European nations that are stuck between the two sides as ultimately bearing the cost. They don't have reliable homegrown natural gas for energy. They've not developed their renewable energy gas sector fast or efficiently enough to sustain them, and then on top of it all, Russia closed the gas valves on the vital gas it supplied. That's why you see farmers in Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands coming out in protest of the draconian clampdown on their herds and farming practices to meet so-called net zero goals. Brussels in particular was ablaze just a few weeks ago with farmers that had enough of a government that would just not let them be. It's compounded by utopian goals like the European Green Deal, which aims to make it the world's first carbon-neutral continent by the year 2050, and it seems like they'll go ahead with the goals no matter who they need to steamroll in order to get there.
This is also a religion. But on the other hand, I think if you're going to converse with people, if you're actually going to have a reasonable conversation with them, I think it has to be about the facts. So basically talking about what can you do? How much good will cutting a ton of CO2 do? How much will it good will it do if you recycle a bottle? How much good will it do if you get more fertilizer for poor people? And it turns out, not surprisingly, that most of the things that we focus a lot on are basically feel-good things that'll do very little, even for poor people, and even in 100 years. And I think the fundamental point is it's really hard to see what is going to happen. I'm going to give you a little bit of background because I think it's important to sort of look at why is it we're so dependent on Russian gas. And the simple answer is because we have lots of renewables. What do you get when you have lots of renewables? You get lots of power when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, but you have none when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. And then you need backup power. In past times, we would get this from coal. Now, coal emits a lot of CO2, so a lot of the continent has simply gone rid of coal-fired power plants. That's overall a good thing, partly because they pollute a lot. They actually kill people through pollutants, but also because they emit a lot of CO2, which obviously is also bad. And so we've gone to gas, but we have not delivered our own gas. So Europe has lots and lots of shale gas, potential shale gas, just like the US. But we have not used it. We have, to a large extent, been incredibly worried about shale gas. Oh, shale gas is probably going to create a lot of earthquakes, or it's going to pollute the drinking water, all those kinds of stories that you also heard in the US. And again, remember, it's not that it was entirely untrue. There are some problems with fracking in the US, but fundamentally, fracking has made the US both much more energy independent, and it has actually reduced dramatically the emissions of the US. The US has reduced its emissions more than any other country in the world over the last 10 years. Europe did not do that because we had cheap Russian gas. And now we're in this pickle. So fundamentally, it's because we don't like coal, we love renewables, and then we need lots of gas. And there we are right now. And of course, that is going to make us very, very vulnerable to pressure from Putin. Everybody has been pointing that out before.
The nexus between Russian gas, the ill-conceived environmentalist policies in Europe, and the invasion of Ukraine is an interesting triangle. Unfortunately, it's mainland Europe that's the losing end right now, simply because it has the most to lose in the first place. Russia has plenty of other markets to pitch its gas to. That's why, despite the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline earlier this year, Russian gas found other major markets to sell to, especially after Europe was feeling American pressure not to buy more gas because it aided Russia financially in the middle of the conflict. When you start to see the complex geopolitics, economics, and military conflicts in their totality, you realize that thinking in one-dimensional environmentalist terms quickly does a lot more harm than good. The fact is, the world does not move in tandem, it moves one piece at a time. If a continent like the EU thinks it can leave its energy and food security so vulnerable while going through a seismic shift in its supply, then perhaps it realized how it was alone in that bad idea after February 2022. That's the kind of utopian thinking that someone like Jordan Peterson and Bjorn Lomborg have been calling out for years, and it's about time that we started listening.